Ayhan Kose, you're the Deputy Chief Economist of the World Bank. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, so the week started on what sounded like a pretty dire warning that we might be facing a lost decade of global growth. You know, I hear a projection like we might be under 3% growth for the next 5 years, maybe 10 years. Why is that a bad thing? Can you explain that?
So, growth is something you need if you would like to have more wealth, if you would like to share that wealth, if you would like to reduce poverty, if you would like to cope with the broader problems like climate change, health problems, education problems. You need economies to grow. Of course, we want that growth to be sustainable. When you look at what happened since the beginning of this millennium, in the first decade, growth potential was around 3%. In the second decade, from 2010 to 20, declined 2.5%. Now, this decade, we are looking at gonna be close to 2%. Whether you look at productivity, you look at investment, whether you look at growth of labor force, we see a slowdown. And these are the fundamental drivers of growth.
So speaking of growth, investment is obviously one key factor. As you mentioned, productivity and labor. There's obviously a concern about labor forces in the most developed countries like Japan, China, the United States, where those workers are aging, right? The whole population is aging.
Yes.
But I'm wondering, World Bank obviously focuses a lot, almost exclusively, on helping the developing world. Is there an advantage there for emerging economies that have younger populations? I'm thinking about Nigeria, for example.
There is huge potential. The big challenge is that whether we can turn that potential into reality and reap the benefits. As you mentioned, in advanced economies, demographic challenge is different. These are aging societies. In some cases, there is no population growth. So you are basically losing labor force. In the case of emerging developing economies, the nature of the problem is different. When you look at Middle East, when you look at Africa, when you look at South Asia, you have big chunk of the society not actively contributing to economic activity. And those are the female members of the society. What we would like to do, we would like to increase the female labor force participation. At the same time, as you mentioned, in some of these emerging developing economies, we have high population growth. We need to make sure we are reaching these new entrants into the labor force, potential entrants, educating them, equipping them with the type of human capital necessary so they can become productive members of the society. Whether they will do that in their own countries or move to advanced economies and do that, that's a different question. But that demographic challenge, as much as its nature is different in different parts of the world, facing us, and it has huge implications for long-term growth prospects.
So skilling, funding, creating the jobs necessary for that emerging population, those young people in these developing countries, whose responsibility, obviously the nation itself, but in the global community, what are you hoping happens in the next decade from the wealthiest countries to help facilitate that?
So there are a plethora of problems. Education is one of them. Of course, we have a ticking time bomb in our hands when you think about climate change. In all of these problems, there is need for the global community to provide the necessary support, especially low-income countries, lower middle-income countries. They need still help from the global community to address bigger development challenges, including education. And can basically the public sector address these problems we are facing, including education? No, that's not going to happen because the magnitude of the problem needs are very large. We need to bring private sector. And there, national governments have to play a critical role. They need to make sure they have stronger institutions, better legal systems, stronger property rights, stronger basically environment that can facilitate private sector to invest in infrastructure, invest in education, invest in health.
So obviously the call is for the wealthiest nations to step up and meet their commitments, right? That's a hard argument in the short term when inflation's dominating all the headlines, knock-on impacts of the war in Ukraine, supply chain issues that are impacting every nation, including the wealthiest. How do you keep them focused on the goals of World Bank when they're confronting those economic challenges themselves?
There is no question we are facing these urgent challenges. The challenges you mentioned, inflation, slowing growth in the near term, and the possibility of even a recession. But these urgent problems should not let us to lose sight of the important problems. And most of these important problems are global problems. We need to find global solutions. There is no way we can say, oh, this problem is somewhere in a remote corner of the world. It won't affect us in this country or in Europe, because it will ultimately affect us. And the issue boils down to availability of resources and the financing. Our hope is that we will have a good dialogue with our membership, with the members of the countries, advanced economies as well as emerging developing economies, and find ways to allocate the resources in the most optimal way. Is it easy? No, but we are optimistic that we can find common ground to address the big allocation problem when it comes to these global challenges.
The theme of this week is reshaping development for a new era. We've heard the word reform come from the mouths of leaders like Emmanuel Macron, Mia Mottley of Barbados. It's definitely a referendum on how these Bretton Woods organizations are doing business moving forward. Has that been internalized, and to what extent are conversations already happening about what the future of development could look like?
I think the simple answer is that yes. There is no question both the IMF and the World Bank internalize the calls and well aware of the problems. Let's not forget one thing. We are on the front lines. We are the ones talking to country authorities. In the case of World Bank, we are on the ground dealing with the development problems. On the one hand, we need to think about how we are doing our business, make sure we are making improvements on the necessary parts of that processes, and at the same time we need to find a way to improve the resources. It is necessary to provide the solutions and stop talking about, in a sense, the problems.
Generative AI is obviously making headlines around the world. I just wanted to briefly ask you, do you see it as a potential tool to help the developing world, or do you think it could only further exacerbate inequality?
Now, this is just a new phenomenon. We need to see and understand better how it is going to be utilized. It is in early days to basically think about this ultimate impact. Whenever we think about these innovations, we need to find ways to utilize them in a way that they translate into real dividends, and we need to find ways to mitigate the adverse impacts if there are adverse impacts.
Is a global recession coming, yes or no?
Now, when we look at the global economy in the near term, we see serious challenges. The global economy is slowing. That slowdown is basically apparent everywhere. The challenge is that to reduce inflation, we need to keep monetary policy still in terms of interest rates on the contractionary side. Fiscal policy need to be on the sideline, cannot be very active, but has to target the populations need help, whatever segments of those populations. Now, if there is a serious systemic financial stress episode, we might see a deeper downturn. Whether that is a global recession, there's a technical definition of that. We need to wait and see. Hopefully, we will avoid that.
So that's a maybe?
Hopefully, we will avoid it. Yeah.
Okay. Ayhan Kose, thank you so much.
Thank you.